The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and tension as Jasmine Crockett strode through the large wooden doors. Clad in a navy blue tailored suit, her expression was calm, but her eyes carried the fire of purpose. Around her neck hung a modest gold cross, a quiet symbol of faith she had worn since law school. This wasn't just another court appearance. Today, she was defending a young black man wrongfully accused in a case that had drawn national attention. The media had painted him guilty before trial even began, and Jasmine knew the road ahead would be rough. As she approached the defense table, she nodded reassuringly to her client, then began organizing her case files. The murmur in the courtroom died down as Judge Harrison entered. Known for his rigid courtroom rules and thinly veiled disdain for anything he considered unprofessional or distracting, he took his seat with a cold glare sweeping across the room. Before the clerk could even call the case, Judge Harrison slammed his gavel sharply. "Counsel, approach the bench," he barked. Jasmine rose and walked to the front, heels clicking confidently. "Yes, Your Honor." He squinted at her, then pointed. "That necklace. The cross. Remove it." Her face remained composed. "I beg your pardon, Your Honor. This is a courtroom, not a church. You're here as an officer of the court, not a missionary. You're violating courtroom decorum." Jasmine stood tall, folding her hands respectfully. "Your Honor, the necklace is a personal item. It's not being displayed as a statement or to influence proceedings. It's simply something I wear." Judge Harrison's face hardened. "You're fined $500. I won't tolerate defiance." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Jasmine turned slightly to look at the observers, then slowly returned her gaze to the bench. She gently placed her hand over the cross, her voice calm but resolute. "Noted, Your Honor," she said, making no move to remove it. She returned to the defense table, her cross still shining gently under the lights. She didn't speak another word, but her silence sent a message loud and clear. She would not be intimidated, not by power, not by prejudice, and certainly not by a gavel. The courtroom settled into a heavy silence as the first witness was called to the stand. Judge Harrison sat with an air of smug control, clearly still displeased with Jasmine's quiet defiance. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused completely on the case, her notes, and her client, blocking out the judge's subtle jabs and the skeptical eyes of those expecting her to crumble. The prosecution launched into their questioning confidently, presenting what seemed like a straightforward narrative. Their key witness, a uniformed officer, spoke with rehearsed precision, describing the defendant as a suspicious presence in the area on the night of the incident. The jurors listened attentively, nodding as exhibits were entered into evidence and a carefully constructed timeline was laid out. To the untrained eye, the case was nearly closed already. But Jasmine sat silently, watching every flicker of hesitation in the witness's face, every misstep in phrasing. She jotted down notes with almost clinical efficiency. When the prosecution finally said, "No further questions," the room shifted slightly, as if everyone braced for what they thought would be a routine cross-examination. She stood up slowly, with a quiet command of the space that made even the stenographer glance up. Her tone was polite, almost gentle. "Officer Daniels, you mentioned seeing my client from across the street, correct?" "Yes," the officer replied confidently. "And the lighting on that block, can you describe it for the court?" "Well, it was dark but there was a streetlight. Near the corner." "Near the corner. Not directly above the spot where you say you identified my client." The officer paused. "No, but, so just to clarify," she said, stepping a few feet closer, "you saw a man in a dark hoodie, in a poorly lit area, from approximately 30 feet away, at night, and were certain enough to arrest him without verifying an ID." The jury stirred. She didn't wait for him to recover. "Let's talk about your report. You wrote that the suspect had a tattoo on his left arm, correct?" "Yes." She turned to the court. "May I request that my client stand?" Judge Harrison hesitated, then nodded. "Granted." Her client stood. Jasmine stepped beside him and gently pulled up his left sleeve. "No tattoo. Never had one. Arrested, detained, and charged based on an assumption," she said clearly. Murmurs grew louder. She then launched into a series of rapid-fire questions, each one highlighting gaps in the testimony, flaws in the arresting officer's process, and contradictions between statements and the evidence. Her voice never rose, but her intensity was undeniable. She quoted obscure case law without referencing notes, challenged procedures using previous rulings from the very circuit they were in, and left the officer visibly shaken. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, lips pursed. His disdain gave way to something more cautious, an unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't just another defense attorney. This was a woman who had come prepared to dismantle the entire case with nothing but the truth in her legal mind. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat, the prosecution looked visibly rattled, the jurors looked wide-eyed, and even the gallery, once skeptical, now watched her with hushed admiration. She didn't smile. She simply adjusted her cross, opened her binder, and waited for the next witness, the calm in her demeanor now crackling with quiet thunder. The courtroom recessed for lunch, but Jasmine remained seated, carefully reviewing her notes as her client leaned in with a whisper of hope in his voice. She nodded reassuringly, then began marking her next lines of questioning in a slim leather notebook. As people began to filter out, a bailiff approached her and cleared his throat softly. "Judge Harrison would like to see you in chambers." She stood, nodding once, and followed the bailiff through the side hallway. The door to the judge's private chambers loomed ahead, oak-paneled, polished, and foreboding. When she entered, Judge Harrison was already seated behind his desk, his robe draped open, his expression unreadable. Gone was the rigid public persona. What remained was something harder to decipher, an unease he hadn't shown before. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Ms. Crockett." She sat gracefully, placing her hands in her lap. "Your Honor." There was a long pause as he studied her. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, and oddly vulnerable. "I read through the supplemental motion you filed this morning," he said finally. "The one citing state versus Langford. That's not a case most attorneys are even aware of, much less know how to use." She nodded. "It set precedent for the very type of procedural misconduct I suspected in this case. It's rarely cited, but highly relevant." "Where'd you find it?" he asked, eyes narrowing with curiosity, not suspicion. "I clerked under Judge Franklin on the Fifth Circuit," she replied. "He wrote the opinion in Langford. I remembered it from the briefings we reviewed. It stuck with me." He leaned back, thoughtful now. "You speak like someone who's argued before higher benches than this one." She smiled softly. "I've spent years fighting battles in places where my voice wasn't welcome. And sometimes, where even my presence wasn't." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I have to admit, when you walked into my courtroom wearing that cross, I made assumptions. About who you were, what kind of lawyer you'd be. I figured," she said, voice steady but not accusatory. "It happens more than you think." He looked down at his desk for a moment, then back up. "I was wrong. You're more than capable. You're exceptional. I don't say that often, and I almost never say it in private." She tilted her head slightly. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the courtroom is where it matters most. Because that's where assumptions become rulings." He looked at her, the weight of her words hanging between them. Something in his demeanor shifted, not quite contrition, but recognition. A man beginning to see beyond his own blinders. "You're still wearing that cross," he said after a moment, his voice quieter. "I always do," she replied. "Not to convert, not to protest, just to remind myself who I am, and why I fight." For the first time since she'd stepped into his courtroom, he didn't respond with a lecture or a ruling. He just nodded once, a slow, reluctant gesture of respect. "You may go," he said quietly. She stood, gave him a professional nod, and walked out without looking back, the cross still resting against her heart, untouched, unfined, and fully hers. The afternoon session began with a palpable shift in the courtroom's energy. The jurors returned more alert than before, the spectators leaned in as if expecting a twist, and even Judge Harrison sat with a strange stillness, no longer interrupting or eyeing Jasmine with the same edge. As the final arguments were prepared, Jasmine stood to deliver her closing remarks with the quiet gravity of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. She walked slowly in front of the jury box, locking eyes with each juror in turn. "Ladies and gentlemen, the law is not perfect. It's carried out by imperfect people, using imperfect tools. But justice only becomes impossible when we allow assumption to replace evidence, and prejudice to replace truth." She turned, gesturing to her client, who sat tall despite the weight he had carried for months. "You've heard testimony built on shadows. You've seen evidence that vanished under scrutiny. And yet, the burden of proof was never meant to shift to him. That's the power of our system, that we presume innocence until it's proven otherwise. Her voice softened, but it never lost its strength. You've seen a man accused because he was nearby, because he looked like someone else, because his presence didn't fit a certain comfort. But proximity is not guilt. Identity is not guilt. Existence is not guilt. She let the silence hang before finishing. The law can't heal every wound, but today, you can protect it from deepening one. When she sat down, the courtroom remained hushed. The prosecution offered a rebuttal, but it fell flat, mechanical, strained, lacking the fire Jasmine had ignited. The judge gave his final instructions, and the jury disappeared into the deliberation room. The wait was short. Too short, some murmured. Within just over an hour, the jury returned. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, stood and read the verdict. Not guilty. Gasps broke the silence, followed by a swelling wave of applause that rippled through the gallery. Jasmine turned to her client, who had already begun to cry, his shoulders shaking as she reached for his hand. He whispered a thank you, but she simply nodded, eyes misting as she absorbed the moment. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, but not to silence the room. Instead, he rose. Before this court adjourns, he said, glancing down at his notes and then directly at Jasmine, I feel compelled to address the counsel for the defense. All eyes turned to her. She stood slowly, unsure of what to expect. Ms. Crockett, I owe you an apology. I made an assumption about your intentions, your professionalism, and your ability. That was a mistake. Today, you've reminded this court that brilliance doesn't need permission to shine. And that the law, at its best, welcomes every voice willing to serve justice. Jasmine inclined her head slightly, respectful but unmoved by the praise. Thank you, Your Honor. I only hope that from now on, that welcome extends to every courtroom. The judge gave a subtle nod. Court is adjourned. As she exited, the press surged forward. Reporters shouted her name, cameras flashed, and microphones surrounded her. But she held her hand up gently, pausing just once to say, justice was served today. That's the only headline that matters. Behind her, her client was embraced by his mother. Supporters clapped and wiped away tears. And as Jasmine Crockett walked down the courthouse steps, the cross at her neck caught the afternoon sun, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a quiet testament to the faith, intellect, and strength it had always carried.